They bulldozed the dock my late wife and I built with our own hands, splinters of cedar drifting like headstones across Lake Whitmore, then invoiced me $250 for trespassing on my own shoreline. I'm Mason Hale, former Army engineer, and that 7-acre island of granite and pine is my father's legacy, inked in deeds and paid in full. Marla Kensington, the clipboard queen of Cedar Crest Lakeside Association, smirked, flashed a glossy plat, and declared my island community amenity. So I did the most infuriating thing a man can do to a bully. I stayed calm. I watched them frame 23 luxury cabins, every nail a confession. While their cameras filmed ribbon cuttings, I quietly gathered iron pins, GPS coordinates, and a blue seal truth that doesn't flinch under oath. Keep watching, because when I place that court-verified deed on the table, their paper empire folds like wet cardboard. Before we dive in, drop your location and local time in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the flip at the end. The morning after they flattened my dock, I stood at the water's edge, staring across the mist at my island, or what used to be mine. Diesel engines hummed on the far shore, hammers cracked against lumber, and bright orange survey flags fluttered where pine trees had stood for 70 years. It didn't feel real. Part of me still thought someone in authority would show up, see the mistake, and shut it all down. But the longer I watched, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake, it was a takeover wearing a smile. I spent the next 3 hours tearing through my home office like a madman. Helen, my late wife, had always kept things in perfect order, labeled folders, date-stamped receipts, tax records stacked like soldiers. But the one thing I needed, the original deed to the island, was missing, not misplaced. Gone. Drawer after drawer, box after box. It was like someone had reached through the years and erased my proof of existence. I found only an old black and white photo of my father standing beside a county surveyor, the lake behind them still wild and untouched. On the back, in my father's handwriting, "Our piece of heaven. Never let them take it." By evening, I was sitting among piles of papers, the room smelling of old dust and despair. Then came the knock. A courier handed me a certified letter with the neat embossed logo of the Cedar Crest Lakeside Association. Inside, in legal jargon thick as mud, it read, "Notice of encroachment fee, $250, due within 30 days for unauthorized personal effects on community land." I stared at the words until they blurred. They were billing me for sitting in a chair by my own fire pit. That's when I realized this wasn't about land or paperwork. It was about power. Marla Kensington didn't want my island. She wanted to make an example, a warning to anyone in the neighborhood who dared question her authority. The next morning, I motored my little aluminum john boat across the water. On the shore, Marla stood with her usual entourage, a foreman, 2 contractors, and her ever-present clipboard. She smiled as if we were old friends bumping into each other at church. "Mr. Hale," she said sweetly, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere with our progress. Once the cabins are up, your property value will double. This is good for everyone. Everyone except the person whose land you're stealing," I said. Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, Mason, you must be mistaken. The new plat map shows this island as part of our community expansion. You should have received the notice." She turned her clipboard so I could see a freshly printed map stamped with county insignia, bold black lines cutting through what was unmistakably my island. I told her I had the deed. She just raised an eyebrow. "Then I suggest you find it quickly. Paperwork has a way of expiring if you don't keep it current." That was her game. Bury me in bureaucracy. Bleed me dry with technicalities. She didn't need to be right. She just needed to look official. I went straight to the county planning office, clutching what little documentation I had. Tax receipts, utility bills, an old survey copy. Behind the counter sat a weary man named Harris, badge clipped to a safety vest, eyes already glazed from a lifetime of dealing with angry property owners. "I filed a complaint," I told him. "Illegal construction on private land. They tore down my dock and are building cabins." He sighed. "Name of the development, Cedar Crest Lakeside." That got a flicker of recognition. He flipped through a file drawer, pulled out a thick binder, labeled Cedar Crest Phase 3. Approved 10/22. "Says here it's authorized by the county." "Authorized how? Who approved this?" He shrugged. "Environmental impact statements, soil reports, plat map, all stamped and signed." I asked to see them. The pages looked official enough, colored diagrams, embossed seals, professional formatting. But the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. The dates were too neat, the signatures too perfect, the approval stamps identical in spacing and ink tone. It was like a photocopy masquerading as legitimacy. Then the door opened, and in walked Marla herself, flanked by a tall man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase. She greeted Harris like an old friend, handed him a cup of coffee, and turned that same plastic smile toward me. Mr. Hale still chasing ghosts, I see. The man in the suit introduced himself as Ethan Ridge, legal counsel for Cedar Crest Association. All in order, he said smoothly. This parcel was incorporated into our master plan last fall. The public hearing was posted, but Mr. Hale apparently didn't attend. I clenched my jaw, because it was never posted anywhere. He gave a small, sympathetic chuckle. Sometimes people miss notices, sir. Happens all the time. Harris flipped a few more pages clearly out of his depth. Looks good to me, he mumbled. Seems like a civil issue, not a county one. And just like that, the conversation was over. Marla's lawyer had the binder, I had a pile of receipts, and Harris had a lunch break to get back to. Outside, Marla leaned in close, her perfume sharp as battery acid. You can't win this, Mason. It's already been decided. That night, I sat on my porch, as the sound of chainsaws carried over the water. Floodlights glowed like campfires from hell. I could almost hear Helen's laugh from the days we'd spent building that dock together, the sound of the hammer echoing off the water. The grief hardened into something else, a quiet, methodical anger, the kind engineers are known for. I realized shouting wouldn't save my island, but documentation might. Over the next week, I began my own investigation. I learned that while a county plat can approve construction permits, any change of property boundaries must also be filed and recorded with the State Registry of Deeds. Without that seal, the plat is just a draft, a glorified suggestion. Marla and her lawyer had skipped that step. Either through arrogance or ignorance, they'd built their empire on sand. Still, I needed proof. Something older, deeper. So I drove 2 towns over to find Raymond Cole, a retired surveyor who'd worked for the county in the 50s. He lived in a small ranch house surrounded by rusting tools and stacks of rolled maps. When I showed him a photocopy of my father's 1956 survey, his eyes widened. Old man Hemlock drew this, he said, running a finger over the faded lines. Best damn surveyor we ever had. Used iron rebars for corner markers, never trusted wooden stakes. I asked if those markers could still exist. He nodded slowly. If no one blasted the granite, those pins are still there. Steel and rock doesn't lie. He disappeared into his garage and returned with a dusty ledger bound in leather. These are Hemlock's original coordinate logs. Might help you find your truth. Holding that old book felt like gripping a weapon forged from the past. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Back home, I plugged those coordinates into a GPS app, cross-referencing with satellite topo data. Each point formed a perfect boundary around the island, my boundary. And inside that black line, 23 little rectangles, each one a shiny new cabin under construction. The irony made me laugh out loud. They had literally built their dream vacation homes entirely inside my property lines. The next morning, I visited a young surveying firm run by Ava Moreno, a veteran I'd met through the VFW. I didn't mention the HOA, just told her I needed a boundary confirmation survey with certified GPS precision. 2 weeks later, a courier dropped off a thick envelope. Inside was a certified survey map, embossed and sealed, every coordinate verified against the original 1954 deed description. I framed that map, slid it under glass on my desk, and stared at it like a general studying a battle plan. For now, I'd let Marla and her army of contractors keep building. Let them pour more concrete, invest more money, dig their own grave, one foundation at a time. Every nail, every invoice, every cabin was another count of evidence waiting for its day in court. From my porch, I watched their lights twinkle across the lake each night. And when Marla occasionally caught sight of me standing silent on my dock's remains, she'd smirk and wave like she was greeting a defeated old man. What she didn't know was that I wasn't watching their progress. I was timing it, waiting for the right moment when their arrogance would meet my patience in the courtroom. And when that day came, it wouldn't be me losing sleep. I spent the next few days in a rhythm that bordered on obsession. Mornings were for watching binoculars trained across the lake as crews worked like ants, hammering and pouring foundations where pine and loam once stood. Afternoons were for digging, not in dirt, but through history. Filing cabinets, old blueprints, tax records, archived plats. My late wife Helen used to joke that engineers don't grieve, they analyze. She wasn't wrong. Grief for me was spreadsheets and topographical maps spread across the dining table. What I was really doing was building a case brick by brick, the same way they were building cabins. Their project rose physically. Mine rose on paper. When I finally found Raymond Cole, the retired county surveyor, he was sitting on the porch of a faded ranch house just outside Flathead County, nursing a glass of sweet tea and wearing a flannel shirt older than me. I introduced myself, explained I owned a small island on Lake Whitmore that was being annexed by a homeowners association, and asked if he remembered a surveyor named Hemlock. Ray squinted, scratching his chin. Old Ben Hemlock, damn right I do. Man was a perfectionist. Used steel rebars for corner markers, drilled them straight into bedrock. Most folks used wood stakes back then, but Hemlock said paper lies. Iron doesn't. Those words felt like a sermon. Would any of those markers still be there, I asked. He chuckled. Son, unless someone dynamited your island, those pins are still sitting where Ben put them 70 years ago. He disappeared inside and came back with a ledger book the size of a Bible. This is Hemlock's log, he said, handing it over like sacred scripture. Each page was handwritten coordinates, bearing meticulous notes and symbols only an engineer would appreciate. In that moment, I didn't just have hope, I had a map back to truth itself. Back home, I spent the evening feeding those coordinates into my laptop, cross-referencing them with the latest satellite data from the U.S. Geological Survey. The numbers aligned perfectly. The old survey lines matched the outline of the island, like a ghost tracing its own reflection. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I rented a small metal detector and a portable GPS unit. I took my boat across to the island, careful not to cross the new private access fence the HOA had installed across the causeway and anchored just off the rocky shoreline. With a handheld spade, I began searching near the coordinates. It didn't take long. The first ping came within 10 minutes, a faint metallic tone buried under a few inches of moss and soil. I scraped carefully until a rusted steel pin emerged, the end capped with a weathered tag stamped 1956 Hemlock Serve. I found all four, each in perfect alignment, each exactly where Ray's book said they'd be. Standing at the last one, overlooking the half-built cabins, I felt a calm so deep it was almost dangerous. It was the calm that comes before you drop a hammer. That same afternoon, I drove to town and met with Ava Moreno, the owner of a small but reputable surveying firm called Northline Geometrics. I'd met her once at a veterans event. She was a former Army combat engineer turned civil surveyor. I showed her Hemlock's log, the GPS coordinates, and my photos of the iron pins. She listened without interrupting, then said simply, "You want this airtight?" "Yes," I replied. "I want something that can't be argued with." "Then you'll get it," she said. For 2 weeks, Ava and her team worked quietly. They didn't tell anyone from the HOA why they were surveying. They just showed up in bright vests, took measurements, and left. When the report arrived, it was a masterpiece of precision. A certified boundary survey complete with high-resolution GPS overlays, elevation contours, and a raised official seal. It clearly showed that all 23 cabins were fully inside my property lines, not one or two, but every single structure. That night I poured myself a drink for the first time in months. Not to celebrate, just to mark the shift. The balance had changed. For the first time, they were the ones building illegally. But I wasn't done. See, a true engineer never wins by shouting gotcha too early. You let the system trap itself. You let arrogance pour its own foundation until it can't move. Over the next few weeks, I kept a routine that would have fooled anyone watching. I mowed the lawn. I fixed the roof on my boathouse. I waved to neighbors driving by, some of whom couldn't even meet my eyes. They'd heard the HOA's version of the story, that I was a bitter old man obsessed with a useless island trying to block community growth. Fine, let them believe it. The quieter I stayed, the less they'd suspect what was coming. Every couple of days, though, I'd drive to the county recorder's office and spend hours in their dusty basement archives. I studied every filing, every permit, every plat. What I discovered was even more beautiful than I'd hoped. The HOA's so-called Phase 3 expansion map was indeed filed with the county, but never registered at the state level, as required by Montana Revised Code 763301. In legal terms, that meant the plat was non-binding, a developer's doodle, not a deed. I made copies of every relevant document, labeled and cross-referenced them, and stored them in a weatherproof box in my workshop. I even started filming short videos of the island from across the water, time-stamped with GPS data showing ongoing construction. Evidence was piling up like ammunition in a bunker. Still, Marla kept pushing. One morning, a man in a security uniform, complete with mirrored sunglasses and a shiny badge reading Cedar Crest Compliance Officer, walked up my driveway and taped a paper to my front door. Notice of trespass and harassment. It accused me of attempting unauthorized access to HOA-controlled property and verbal intimidation of contractors. The so-called incident they cited was the day I yelled "stop" as they demolished my dock. They were rewriting history line by line. That night, I called my daughter Riley in Denver. She worked in marketing, lived in a condo where HOA fees were higher than most people's rent. She loved me but didn't understand why I was still fighting. "Dad, you can't win against an HOA," she said. "They've got lawyers and insurance and time. You've got, well, a stubborn streak." I smiled at that. "That's all I've ever needed." She sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I always am," I said. But the truth was I was past careful. I was strategic. By the end of that summer, Cedar Crest had finished their construction. 23 identical lakeside luxury cabins lined my island like toy houses on stolen earth. They even had the audacity to list them online, $425 a night, managed by Cedar Crest Association. The photos showed pristine private waters and exclusive resident amenities. My trees, my shoreline, my view. They'd built their dream community, and I just built their ruin. The final puzzle piece fell into place when I called Ray again to confirm one thing, whether Hemlock's original 1,956 survey had ever been superseded by another legal record. He checked his old files and laughed. "Superseded? Hell no. That's the last valid survey ever done for that parcel. Anything newer would have had to record a change through the state registry. If they didn't do that, son, your deed still rules." My next move wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no shouting match. Just a quiet trip to the Superior Court of Montana, a manila folder in hand. Inside were my certified survey, Hemlock's logs, the recorded deeds dating back to 1954, and documentation of the unregistered plat. I filed a quiet title action requesting the court to reaffirm ownership of the parcel and declare all HOA structures as unauthorized encroachments. Then I waited. I didn't tell a soul, not even Riley. Because sometimes revenge works best when the world thinks you've already given up. Filing a quiet title action doesn't look dramatic. There's no gavel slam, no cinematic confrontation. It's a manila envelope sliding through a clerk's window, the stamp received. County Superior Court, leaving a soft thud like a heartbeat. But that's how real battles start quietly. Lawyers call it curing title uncertainty. I call it arming yourself with silence. I left the courthouse that morning and drove home along the lake road. The air smelled of rain and diesel. Across the water, I could see the cabins shining like teeth. Brand new decks, shiny aluminum gutters, flower boxes hung by people who thought they'd bought a slice of paradise. They didn't realize their paradise was sitting on stolen ground. That night I poured myself coffee and read through the motion one more time. It was beautiful in its simplicity. The action asked a judge to determine once and for all who owned that island. The HOA and their developer had 30 days to respond to prove it was theirs, and if they didn't, I would win by default. The next morning, I took my boat out before sunrise, gliding through the fog. On the far shore, someone had hung a massive banner between two pines, Cedar Crest Lakeside Cabins, grand opening this weekend. They were celebrating before the ink on their crime had even dried. I couldn't help but smile. They just built me the most expensive evidence display in the state. I didn't tell anyone about the lawsuit. Not Riley, not my neighbors, not even Ray. A quiet title case works best when it stays that way quiet. I wanted Marla and her developer friend Griffin Dale to believe they'd won. Arrogance is a weakness you can measure in cubic yards of concrete. And arrogance they had plenty of. 3 days later, a glossy brochure appeared in every mailbox in our community. It showed the cabins on my island gleaming under golden light. Now accepting summer rentals. Managed by Cedar Crest HOA, it read. The brochure bragged about exclusive amenities including private fishing docks, boat slips, and secure gated causeway access. I nearly laughed when I saw the photo my demolished dock replaced by a prefab aluminum one. Marla's quote was printed in bold. "This development represents progress and unity. Cedar Crest is a family, and we're building for the next generation. Progress, unity, family. Fine words to hide theft." Meanwhile, I watched the legal clock tick down. Each day that passed was a nail in their coffin. The HOA board held meetings, threw parties, and issued new fines to residents for mailbox, paint colors, and trash bins left out too long. They were drunk on authority. On the 12th day, I received a letter not from the court but from my insurance company. It was short, clinical, and cold. Your homeowner's policy will be terminated in 30 days due to unresolved land use disputes adjacent to a commercial development. They'd gotten to them. Marla and her lawyer had probably hinted that I was non-compliant or a risk. Without insurance, my mortgage would fall into default. They were trying to starve me out. I spent that evening walking the shoreline thinking of Helen. The wind moved across the lake like breath, through an open window. I could almost hear her voice. Engineers don't panic. We plan. So I planned. If they wanted to weaponize paperwork, I'd turn bureaucracy into artillery. I gathered my records, the certified survey, Hemlock's coordinates, the unregistered plat copies my tax receipts. I organized everything into a single binder, black cover, clear labels, color-coded tabs. I even added photos of each iron pin and GPS overlay printouts. When I was done, it looked more professional than anything Ethan Ridge, their HOA lawyer, could wave around. Then I waited. By the 28th day, I knew what was coming: nothing. No filing, no response, no counterclaim. Marla must have seen the court notice, tossed it in the trash, and assumed it was another empty threat from the crazy old man across the lake. 31 days later, I put on a clean flannel, tucked my binder under my arm, and drove back to the courthouse. The hearing room was nearly empty, just me, the judge, and a bored clerk. The judge was Honorable Peter McAllister, a man whose face looked carved from the same stone as the courthouse itself. I'd seen him once before, years ago, when I testified in a county infrastructure dispute. He didn't suffer fools. He flipped through my binder, carefully pausing on the certified survey. "These are original corner coordinates, yes, Your Honor," I said. "Verified by the original county surveyor's logs, confirmed by GPS, and cross-checked with the U.S. Geological Survey database." He raised an eyebrow, and the defendants did not respond. "Your Honor." He sighed, clicked his pen, and signed his name with a slow, deliberate stroke. Order granted. Just like that, it was done. The island was legally, irrefutably mine again. The judge declared all structures built upon it to be unauthorized encroachments, subject to removal or compensation at the owner's discretion. It was, in essence, a nuclear button. I drove home with that stamped order sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting, painting the lake gold. Across the water, the cabins glowed warm and inviting. Somewhere out there, families were checking in for the weekend, toasting marshmallows on a shoreline that wasn't theirs. Let them enjoy it, I thought. Every good trap needs bait. I knew Marla would find out soon enough. Court orders are public record, and small towns gossip faster than wildfire. Still, I needed leverage, something that would hit harder than paper. So I made some calls to old colleagues, retired civil engineers, environmental consultants, men and women who owed me favors from decades of military projects. I didn't tell them the full story, just posed a hypothetical. What happens, I asked, if a developer builds 23 residential cabins on land without valid septic permits directly over a protected watershed? He let out a low whistle. That's a violation of both state and federal environmental codes. Clean Water Act, maybe EPA oversight. The fines alone could bankrupt a small county. Perfect. The next morning, I visited the County Environmental Enforcement Division. I met with a woman named Janet Sloan, a field investigator with a clipboard, and zero patience for nonsense. I showed her the court order, the survey maps, and aerial photos of the cabins. Her eyes widened. "They really built this without state permits. Looks that way," I said. "And now they're renting them to the public." She nodded slowly, already making notes. "We'll be sending a team out this week." 2 mornings later, 3 county enforcement trucks rolled across the causeway, ignoring the big private access, residents-only sign. I watched from my porch through binoculars as the agents fanned out across the island. Within minutes, they were slapping bright orange "Do Not Occupy" and "Stop Work" stickers on every cabin door. It was the most beautiful shade of orange I'd ever seen. From the far side of the lake came the faint sound of shouting, Marla's voice shrill and panicked. She tried to argue, waving her clipboard, but Janet simply pointed to the official court order in her hand. It wasn't even a fight. That afternoon, the HOA sent out an emergency email blast to every resident. The subject line: Urgent Community Update, Interference, and False Claims. It accused an unnamed individual of sabotaging the Cedar Crest project with baseless legal filings. They even used the word terroristic once. Subtle as always. My neighbors were suddenly on edge. One of them, George, a kind man whose wife once baked Helen cookies every Christmas, whispered over the fence, "Mason, what's happening? They say you called the feds on us." I smiled gently. "Not on you, George. Just on whoever thought they could move mountains with forged maps." He chuckled nervously, unsure whether to believe me. Marla, she's furious. They're holding a big meeting tomorrow night. You might want to stay home." "On the contrary," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "I think I'll attend." For months, Marla Kensington had spoken over me. Tomorrow she'd have to listen. Because I wasn't bringing anger to that meeting. I was bringing truth sealed in blue ink. The next evening, the parking lot outside the Cedar Crest Community Center looked like a county fair. SUVs lined both sides of the road, porch lights flickered across the lake, and the murmur of angry neighbors filled the air. You could taste the tension, fear disguised as indignation. The HOA had sent out invitations marked "Mandatory Community Meeting, Attendance Required." Translation: Marla wanted witnesses. I parked at the edge of the lot and sat for a moment watching the reflection of those 23 cursed cabins glimmer across Lake Whitmore. My heart beat slow, steady. For months I'd lived in quiet fury. Tonight that silence would become a weapon. Inside the room was packed 200 residents, folding chairs squeezed together like an angry congregation. At the front stood Marla Kensington, the self-anointed empress of Cedar Crest. She wore a white blazer and pearls, the kind of armor people like her think makes them untouchable. On the table beside her sat the inevitable props, a thick binder, a microphone, and the HOA's attorney, Ethan Ridge, already sweating under the fluorescent lights. I slipped in quietly and stood at the back. Marla's voice cut through the noise like a chainsaw. "Thank you for coming, everyone. We are here to address a deliberate act of sabotage against our community." She pointed at a projector screen showing a photo of one of the cabins now branded with an orange "Stop Work" sticker. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone filed a false court claim against us, triggering these unlawful enforcement actions. Our property values are plummeting, and our reputation is at stake. A man in the front row shouted, "Who did it?" Marla didn't hesitate. "Mr. Mason Hale," she said, letting my name hang in the air like a sentence. All heads turned toward me. She smiled that saccharine predator's smile. "Would you like to defend yourself, Mr. Hale, or have you already done enough damage?" I walked slowly down the center aisle. The crowd parted just enough to let me through. The sound of my boots echoed on the polished floor. "I would," I said evenly, "but I don't need to defend myself. I came to show you something." Marla crossed her arms. "Unless you have evidence, this is." I reached into my jacket and placed a thick folder on the table with a single heavy thud. "Evidence enough." She glanced down, pretending indifference. "More conspiracy theories, I suppose." "Not theories," I said. "Judgments." I opened the folder and pulled out the court order stamped and signed 3 days ago. The paper caught the light, the embossed seal gleaming pale blue. "This," I said, my voice carrying through the hall, "is a legal order from Judge McAllister of Flathead County Superior Court. It confirms me as the sole and rightful owner of Lake Whitmore Island. Every single cabin you built sits on private property, my property." The room went still. Marla blinked once, twice, like a computer freezing mid-command. "That's absurd. We have the plats." "The county approved our—" "You have drafts," I interrupted. "Filed locally, never registered with the state recorder. You built on air and arrogance." A murmur spread through the crowd, uncertain, shifting. People looked at one another, searching for someone to tell them what to believe. Ethan Ridge leaned forward, his voice smooth but shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, anyone can print a document and stamp a seal. That order could be fraudulent. If Mr. Hale insists on spreading lies, we'll pursue defamation." I smiled thinly. "Funny you should mention that." Right on cue, the side door opened. A man in a county uniform walked in carrying a leather folio. His badge read Cliff Marks, County Records Clerk. He looked like someone who hated being late for dinner. Marla's eyes widened. "What is this, Mr. Marks?" I said, "Would you please confirm the authenticity of this document?" He cleared his throat, stepping up to the microphone. "This order was processed by our office 3 days ago. I personally filed it under docket number 27458C. It is an official and binding ruling of the Superior Court." The room collectively exhaled a sound somewhere between shock and betrayal. Marla's face drained of color. "That can't be right," she whispered. You're lying." Cliff looked almost apologetic. "Ma'am, I don't lie about court orders." Then came the voices. First one, then a dozen. "You said it was community land. You used our reserve funds for this. Did you even check with the county? What about the assessments we paid?" Marla held up her hands, her voice cracking. "Everyone, please. This is being twisted. We were misled by the developer, by the attorney, but her attorney was already backing away, clutching his briefcase like it might shield him from the mob." I didn't need to say another word. The residents were saying it for me. Years of bottled-up frustration were spilling out, all the fines, the citations, the power trips. Someone shouted, "You fined my wife for a bird feeder." Another yelled, "You threatened to tow my truck over a cracked windshield." Marla slammed her gavel on the podium. "Order, I am still president of this association, and this meeting is adjourned." But no one sat down. The doors at the back swung open again. Two county deputies stepped in, followed by a familiar face, Janet Sloan, the environmental investigator. In her hand was a thick stack of paperwork. Marla Kensington. Janet said, her voice clear and cutting. You are hereby served with a cease and desist order for unauthorized construction, environmental violations, and trespass on private property. Marla stammered. This is harassment. You can't. Janet didn't flinch. You built 23 cabins without proper state permits on land you do not own. You ignored cease orders and falsified documents. You'll want to call your lawyer if he's still around. Ethan Ridge was already gone. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marla's hand trembled as she picked up the papers. Then her composure cracked. You can't do this to me, she screamed, her voice echoing off the hall's rafters. I built this community. I made it beautiful. The deputies gently took her by the arms. Cameras flashed. Some residents had pulled out their phones. One woman whispered, "Oh my God," as the self-proclaimed queen of Cedar Crest was escorted past the community vision poster she'd hung on the wall herself. And just like that, the tyranny ended. After she was gone, the room fell into an eerie quiet. Papers fluttered from the table, the microphone still humming faint feedback. I walked up, picked up her gavel, and set it down gently on the wood. Justice, I said softly, doesn't need to shout, it just needs a signature. Somewhere behind me, someone started clapping. Then another, and another. It wasn't loud applause, more like a sigh of collective relief. By the time I left that night, the air outside smelled of pine and rain again. The storm had broken. But the next few days were chaos. The Maple Shores collapse, as the newspapers dubbed it, hit like a grenade. The state environmental office levied massive fines, 6 figures worth, for watershed violations and illegal septic installations. The developer Griffin Dale filed bankruptcy within 48 hours and vanished overseas. HOA funds were frozen, the board dissolved. Neighbors who'd once avoided me began knocking on my door, some to apologize, some to ask what came next. One even brought a homemade pie and whispered, "Guess we all owe you a thank you." I told them I didn't need thanks. I just wanted peace. But peace has a way of showing up late. Because while the HOA was dead, I now owned 23 shiny, half-finished cabins sitting squarely on my land, and I knew what Helen would have said, "Don't waste what can be fixed." That night I walked to the lake's edge, looked across at those cabins, silhouettes against the moonlight, and smiled. They had stolen my dock, my quiet, and months of my life. Now they were going to pay for my retirement. The morning after Marla's meltdown, the lake was still. It was the kind of eerie quiet that follows a storm, the sort where you can feel the world taking a breath after something irreversible. I stood on my porch with a mug of black coffee, watching a lone heron glide low over the water. Across the lake, the cabins sat empty doors sealed with bright orange "Do Not Occupy" stickers that glowed like warning lights in the dawn. I could still see the faint outlines of tire tracks where the county enforcement trucks had crossed the causeway the day before. And though I hadn't planned it, I couldn't deny that a part of me enjoyed how poetic it was they built their empire on my land, and now they couldn't step foot on it without breaking the law. By noon, the local news vans had arrived. The story spread faster than wildfire. Headlines read, "HOA president arrested after building cabins on private land." Cedar Crest collapse residents, furious over stolen funds. Every reporter wanted a quote. I gave none. My silence was its own statement. But victory, I learned, doesn't always come wrapped in satisfaction. Because while the HOA was finished, their debris was now my problem. 23 gleaming half-finished cabins, each with a mortgage of headaches attached. Some were barely wired, others lacked plumbing. All sat atop soil scarred by their construction, and the septic systems, as I'd suspected, were illegal. I spent the next few days walking the island with a notebook, taking stock like a man appraising a battlefield. The structures were sturdy. The craftsmanship, at least on the surface, wasn't terrible, cheap siding, sure, but solid framing. An engineer sees potential in wreckage, and I was no different. On the 4th day, I called Ava Marino, the veteran surveyor who had helped me prove ownership. "How do you feel about another project?" I asked. "Depends," she said, amused. "Does it involve chasing HOA tyrants?" "Not this time. This one's about rebuilding." She arrived with her crew that weekend. Together we inspected every cabin. They found code violations like Easter eggs, missing fire stops, ungrounded outlets, undersized beams. Nothing fatal, but enough to make the county reject occupancy permits. "They cut corners everywhere," Ava said, shaking her head. "It's almost impressive how bad they were at cheating." "Can it be fixed?" She grinned. "Anything can be fixed with the right budget and enough coffee." So I made a decision. Instead of demolishing them, I'd finish the job legally, properly, and under my name. I filed applications for new building permits attaching my court order and a certified statement of ownership. When the clerk looked up at me half smiling, I could tell she already knew who I was. "So you're the guy who brought down Cedar Crest," she said. "I'm the guy cleaning up after them," I replied. "Good luck," she said, stamping my permits. "You'll need it." Over the next month, the island transformed again, but this time under honest hands. Crews replaced faulty wiring, reworked plumbing, and installed proper septic systems approved by the state. I hired local tradesmen, many of whom had been fined or bullied by the HOA in the past. They worked with a sense of satisfaction that money alone couldn't buy. During lunch breaks, we'd sit on the half-built porches eating sandwiches, swapping stories. One guy, a mason named Rick, told me Marla had once fined his mother for hanging wind chimes. She said they violated the sound uniformity code, he laughed. Guess she didn't like hearing joy. Guess not, I said. When the repairs were nearly done, I called Janet Sloan from Environmental Enforcement. She came out with her clipboard, walked every inch of the island, and nodded approvingly. "Everything checks out," she said. "You've turned a disaster into a showcase. I'll file the clearance paperwork myself." It took 63 days and every bit of my savings. But when it was over, the cabins gleamed under the summer sun, sturdy up to code, and ready for something better than corruption. Riley came to visit for the first time in months. She stepped off the boat, eyes wide. "Dad, these are beautiful. Hard to believe they were built by thieves, huh?" She looked around. "What are you going to do with them now?" "I'm going to sell them," I said simply. "One by one. No rentals, no corporate management, no HOA ever again. Just families who'll take care of what they buy." We sat on the porch as the lake shimmered, the smell of cedar and fresh paint mixing in the air. For the first time since Helen died, the place felt alive again. Within 3 weeks of listing, the offers poured in. The cabins sold faster than I could sign the paperwork. Young couples, retirees, even a few veterans who wanted peace and water views. By the end of the month, every unit was spoken for. The profit was staggering. When my lawyer tallied everything, he stared at the number like it might bite him. "You realize you just turned a hostile land grab into a multimillion-dollar sale, right?" I smiled. "Engineers call that repurposing." He chuckled. "Most people call it poetic justice." The media called again, asking for interviews. I declined once more. "I'm not a celebrity," I told them. "I'm just a man who built his own dock and refused to watch it sink." That night I sat on the shore where my first dock once stood. George, the neighbor who'd been too afraid to speak up before, walked over with 2 beers in hand. "Heard you're rebuilding it," he said, nodding toward the lake. "I was thinking about it," I said. "Something sturdier this time." He grinned. "You'll have help." A bunch of us talked. We want in. No more HOA nonsense. Just neighbors. The next weekend, half the neighborhood showed up with lumber drills and music. For the first time, the laughter echoing over Lake Whitmore wasn't tainted by politics or fines. By sundown, a new dock stretched 30 feet out into the water, solid as bedrock. Someone carved a name into the top rail, Lena's Dock, Helen's middle name. I didn't stop them. When the last nail was driven, we sat in our row legs, dangling over the edge, watching the sun melt into the horizon. George handed me another beer. "You know," he said, "Marla used to talk about community pride. She just never understood what it meant." I nodded. "Community isn't rules. It's people showing up when they don't have to." He smiled. "So what's next for you, Mason? Retire? For real, maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'll build something new." Riley, sitting beside me, nudged my arm. "You could name the new development after Mom." I looked out at the cabins across the water, their porch lights flickering to life one by one. "No," I said softly. "Not a development, just a home. For me, and for whoever respects the lake." That night, as the stars rose over the quiet water, I realized something. The revenge hadn't been the win in court, or the orange stickers, or even the money. The revenge was peace, the kind you earn by doing things the right way even when no one's watching. The next morning, I walked to the entrance road and found the old weather-beaten HOA sign still standing, Cedar Crest Community, Est, 1996. Someone had spray-painted a crooked red X through it. I tore it down myself, tossed it in the truck bed, and replaced it with a simple wooden board carved by one of the carpenters. "Welcome to Hale Point, respect the lake." And just like that, the story ended, where it began with still water, a cup of coffee, and a quiet promise that this time the peace would last. By the end of summer, the story of Cedar Crest had spread far beyond Lake Whitmore. The regional paper ran a headline that made me laugh out loud. "From island injustice to entrepreneur's triumph, how one man outsmarted his HOA." Entrepreneur. That word made me sound like I'd planned all of it, as if I'd sat down one day and said, "You know what would be fun? A multi-million-dollar property feud." Truth was all I ever wanted, was peace, a dock, a view, and enough quiet to hear my thoughts. But peace rarely comes untested. After Marla's arrest, the rest of the HOA board disintegrated like a sandcastle in the tide. The treasurer resigned first, leaving behind an email that leaked to the public. I told her the plat wasn't legal. She said it didn't matter. The vice president disappeared to Florida, the secretary turned whistleblower, and the remaining members held a vote to dissolve the association entirely. The county auditor's office confirmed what everyone suspected: the HOA had been operating a slush fund. Over $300 0 inches, maintenance fees had been rerouted into community enhancement projects, most of which conveniently lined the pockets of Marla's developer partner, Griffin Dale. Once the news broke, Dale was nowhere to be found. Rumor had it he fled to Belize with what remained of the funds. Cedar Crest was dead. What remained was a ghost of authority, a broken gate, a faded sign, and dozens of homeowners who had once believed in their HOA like it was gospel. You'd think I'd feel vindicated. Maybe I did a little. But mostly, I felt old. There's something sobering about watching people destroy themselves over greed. Still, there was work to be done. Owning an island full of newly sold cabins came with paperwork thicker than any revenge plan. I spent weeks finalizing deeds, drafting easements, and coordinating closings with families moving in. One by one, they came new owners, wide-eyed and polite, some unaware of the scandal that had birthed their homes. I liked that. Fresh starts belong to people who don't know the dirt. I used part of the profit to pay back my savings, every cent I'd poured into rebuilding. Then I made 2 donations, one to the Montana Veterans Housing Trust in Helen's memory, and another to a local scholarship for engineering students. It felt right. The world had taken my dock. I'd built something better in return. But not everyone was ready to move on. About 3 weeks after the last cabin sold, I got a call from Janet Sloan, the environmental inspector. "Thought you'd want to know," she said, voice dry as paper. They filed the final report. The HOA's officially dissolved. The state's closing its investigation into the septic violations. "You're clear," I exhaled. "That's a nice phrase, you're clear. Haven't heard it in a while." "Well, don't get too comfortable," she said. "You've got one more problem. You're technically the successor in liability for those structures, at least until the deeds transfer." In English, she chuckled. "If any leftover debt or environmental issues pop up, they'll call you first." "Fantastic," I muttered. But luck for once was on my side. The buyers were responsible folks, and the transactions went smoothly. Within 2 months, I was free and clear. The bank account was heavier, the land restored, and the lake, for the first time in years, was quiet again. One morning, I took my boat out before sunrise. The mist curled low over the water, and the reflection of the new cabins shimmered like lanterns. I thought about Helen, how she'd loved mornings like this, how she'd insisted on building that dock herself, even though the hammer weighed almost as much as her arm. "A home isn't made by what you build," she used to say. "It's made by who you build it with." As I cut the engine and drifted, I realized something: this fight had never really been about land. It had been about her and the promise I made not to let anyone take what she loved. Still, victory comes with ripples. A week later, I was standing in line at the hardware store when a man I didn't recognize tapped my shoulder. "You're Mason Hale, right?" he asked. "The island guy," I nodded cautiously. He grinned. "Heard what you did." "Damn impressive. My HOA's been bleeding us for years. Phony fines, secret budgets, the works. Wish I had your guts." "Guts are just stubbornness that got lucky," I said. He laughed. "Maybe. You ever think about writing a book? I bet people would love to know how you pulled it off." I shook my head. It wasn't about pulling anything off. It was about not giving up. That line stuck with me long after he left. Maybe that was the real story, not revenge, not triumph, just endurance. That night, I was cleaning out my workshop when I found the old brittle survey map again, the one from 1,956 Hemlock's hand-drawn lines, fading but still legible. I framed it and hung it above the workbench. Beneath it, I placed Helen's photograph, the 2 of us standing on our first dock, grinning like fools, the sun behind us. The caption I scrawled on a scrap of paper and tucked into the frame: "Paper lies. Iron doesn't." A few days later, George came by with a truck full of lumber. "You up for another project?" he asked. "What'd you have in mind, Community Doc?" he said. "Figured now that there's no HOA, maybe we can build one the right way, something everyone can use." I hesitated. "You sure people want that?" He smiled. "They voted on it. Unanimous. You'll be the foreman." So we built it plank by plank, neighbor by neighbor. Kids ran around with hammers too big for their hands. Old-timers swapped stories, and the lake echoed with laughter instead of the grind of bulldozers. It wasn't a perfect dock, slightly crooked, uneven boards, but it was alive. And that's all that mattered. When it was finished, the town council approved renaming our side of the lake. Hale Point, they called it, in recognition of community restoration and integrity. They even installed a cedar sign by the road with the same words I'd etched before Respect the Lake. The dedication ceremony was small but meaningful. Riley came standing beside me in the crisp fall air. "You did it, Dad," she whispered. "You turned something ugly into something good." I looked around at the families, the new homeowners, waving from their porches, the sparkle of water where my old dock once stood. "No," I said quietly. "We did." That night, when the crowd had gone and the stars came out, I sat alone on the dock. The wood was still warm from the sun. I dipped my fingers into the water, cool, clean, unpolluted. Across the lake, the cabins glowed like a constellation. I thought about how the HOA had believed they could own this place with paperwork, how they'd tried to bully and falsify their way to control. But ownership isn't in deeds or fines or signatures. It's in stewardship, the care you give, the respect you show, the promise you keep. The empire of Cedar Crest was gone and good riddance. What rose from its ashes wasn't an empire at all. It was a community. One built not on fear or control, but on quiet defiance and shared hands. When I finally stood to leave, I noticed something at the end of the dock, a small brass plate freshly screwed into the wood. I bent down to read it. It said, "In memory of Helen Hale, the lake always remembers." I didn't cry. Engineers rarely do. But I smiled, and for the first time in years, I let the quiet in. As the night breeze rippled across the water, I whispered to the stars, "You were right, Helen." The dock was never just wood. Fall came early that year. The lake turned silver in the morning, steam rising like breath from its surface. The maples along the shore flamed red, then shed their leaves in lazy spirals. For the first time in years, I didn't wake to the whine of chainsaws or the grind of bulldozers. I woke to birds and quiet. Peace had weight again, the kind that presses against your ribs, reminding you it's real. But peace, like any gift, comes with a bill. And mine arrived one chilly October morning in the form of an official envelope stamped Internal Revenue Service. I laughed when I opened it, not because it was funny, but because irony has a sense of humor sharper than any HOA lawyer. The letter congratulated me on the sale of the cabins and helpfully reminded me of something called capital gains tax, a very large one. My victory had made me wealthier on paper than I'd ever been, and now Uncle Sam wanted his share. I spent an entire day crunching numbers at my kitchen table, surrounded by receipts, closing documents, and half-drunk coffee. Even after deductions for restoration costs and charitable donations, the number staring back at me was eye-watering. Still, I couldn't bring myself to complain. I'd fought for this legally, honestly. Paying taxes on justice felt like signing the final page of a long, ugly contract with life. When I told Riley, she just laughed. "That's the price of peace, Dad. Rich people problems." "Peace isn't rich," I said. "It's just expensive." She grinned. "You should put that on a t-shirt." To her credit, she helped me navigate the financial mess, calling accountants and lawyers until the numbers finally made sense. By Thanksgiving, everything was settled. The debt paid, the profits clean, and my name for the first time in years, free of disputes. With the chaos behind me, I started fixing things that had nothing to do with money. My knees, for instance, which had endured too many days of climbing ladders and hauling lumber, the roof of my own house, which had quietly leaked through the drama, and my garden, which had become more weeds than flowers. The neighbors began stopping by more often. George brought firewood. His wife baked pies. The younger couples from the new cabins came over on weekends asking for advice about wells plumbing or just to chat. I'd become something I never expected to be, the quiet old guy. Everyone respected the unintentional patriarch of a lakeside family that had rebuilt itself from the rubble of greed. One afternoon, while fixing a storm shutter, I heard a car crunching up the gravel drive. It was a black sedan, government plates. For a split second, I felt the old knot of dread in my gut. Another lawsuit, another bureaucratic twist. But when the door opened, I recognized the man who stepped out, Deputy Harris, the same county inspector who had once sided with Marla during .war. My first complaint. He looked older, thinner, and much less certain of himself. "Mr. Hale," he said awkwardly, "mind if I have a word?" "Sure," I said, leaning my hammer against the porch. "Long-time inspector." He sighed. "I deserved that. Listen, I wanted to apologize. I should have looked closer at those documents. You were right, and I let them steamroll me." I studied him for a moment. There was no smugness, no spin, just guilt. "You had a boss to please, Harris." "I get it." "No," he said firmly. I had a choice, and I took the easy one. We stood in silence, the lake glittering behind us. Finally, he reached into his jacket and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of my old dock, the one they'd destroyed. It was a county archive photo, time-stamped and dated, taken just weeks before the bulldozers arrived. "I thought you might want this for your records," he said. "It's proof that it existed." I looked at the photo, at the smooth water and the faded blue chairs Helen and I had placed there years ago. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. "Thank you," I said finally. "It's proof that something good once stood and that it can again." He nodded. "You built it back better. That counts." After he left, I framed that photo and hung it beside the new one of Lena's dock. Two eras side by side, the past I lost and the present I earned. By winter, the lake froze solid enough for skating. The new families held a small celebration on Christmas Eve, setting lanterns on the ice, their orange glow dancing across the dark. I joined them, standing off to the side, smiling as children skated clumsily across what used to be a battleground. George handed me a mug of spiced cider. "Can you believe this place, Mason? 6 months ago it was lawsuits and shouting matches. Now look at it." "I can believe it," I said, "because we built it." He laughed. "You built it. We just stopped hiding." We stood there in the cold, the air filled with laughter and the faint hiss of skates cutting ice. For the first time, I realized that revenge hadn't just healed my wounds, it had healed everyone else's too. In February, I received a letter from the Flathead County Historical Society. They'd heard about the case and wanted to include the story of Lake Whitmore's transformation in a local exhibition about land rights and community restoration. I nearly declined. I wasn't interested in fame, but Riley convinced me. "Dad, it's not about showing off," she said. "It's about teaching people what happens when someone stands up." So I agreed. The exhibit opened in April. I didn't attend the ribbon cutting, but Riley did. She called afterward, describing how my framed survey maps hung beside photos of the cabins, and that old news clipping, "HOA president arrested for trespass." There was even a small plaque with my name on it, "Mason Hale, engineer." Veteran neighbor. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the truth. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Helen would have loved that line. That spring, the new dock bloomed with life again. Fishermen cast their lines at dawn, kids splashed in the shallows by afternoon, and at sunset, couples strolled across the boards hand in hand. It wasn't grand, but it was real, and that's all I ever wanted. One evening, as the sun sank low, Riley came to sit beside me. "You ever think about selling the house?" she asked. I smiled. "And give up all this quiet?" She laughed. "You quiet, you took down an entire HOA. That was years of pent-up silence exploding all at once." She looked out over the lake. "I still can't believe they thought they could own this. A lake, a view, a piece of sky. That's the trouble with people who crave control," I said softly. "They mistake stewardship for ownership. One protects, the other consumes." We sat there a long time watching the water shift from gold to black. Finally, she said, "You know, Mom would be proud." "I know," I whispered. "Because I didn't just rebuild what they broke. I rebuilt what she believed in." When she left that night, I stayed a little longer, listening to the frogs and the wind. The stars reflected off the lake like sparks. I thought about all the forms, fines, forged maps, and shouting matches that had filled the last 2 years, the empire of paper as fragile as it was loud. And I realized something Helen probably knew all along. In the end, everything returns to stillness. The noise burns out, the liars fade. But the truth, the real kind, the kind anchored in bedrock and memory that endures. I touched the wooden rail beside me, smooth and warm from the day's sun, and whispered, "You can't vote against gravity." Then I laughed, because it was true in water, in justice, and in life. Everything eventually settles where it belongs. Spring came to Lake Whitmore in quiet layers, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder or color, but with slow forgiveness. The ice melted in sheets that cracked like old glass. The shoreline thawed, and the wind smelled faintly of pine sap and wet earth. By April, I'd fallen into a rhythm. Every morning at 6, I made coffee, walked down to Lena's dock, and sat for an hour before the world remembered to make noise. I still caught myself scanning the opposite bank, sometimes half expecting to see construction trucks or survey flags fluttering like taunts from the past. But there was nothing left to fight. Only calm water, fresh paint, and neighbors who waved instead of glared. The cabins across the lake were all occupied now. New families, new laughter. The sound of children skipping stones had replaced the old mechanical drone of generators. Some mornings I'd see smoke rising from their chimneys and smile. That land was healthy again, legally, environmentally, spiritually. One morning, a small boat puttered toward my dock. It was George as usual, with his yellow Labrador in the bow and 2 steaming cups in hand. "Peacekeepers Patrol," he called out, tossing me 1 cup. "Hazelnut, just how you like it." "Appreciate it," I said, taking a sip. "You ever miss the chaos?" He laughed. "Miss it? Hell no. But sometimes I can't believe it's really gone. I still expect Marla to pop out of the bushes waving a clipboard." I chuckled. "If she does tell her, I charge rent now." He leaned against the dock post, serious for a moment. "You know, Mason folks around here talk about you like you're a legend, the man who beat the HOA, like you cast some kind of spell that lifted a curse." "I didn't cast anything," I said. "I just held my ground. Same difference if you ask me." Later that afternoon, I took the boat out for a slow lap around the island. My island for the first time since winter. I didn't go ashore often anymore. The cabins were all privately owned now, and I wanted the new residents to feel free, not haunted by the old man who'd once gone to war for their property lines. Still, as I drifted along the shallows, I could see the places that held ghosts, the bend of rock where Helen and I had first built our dock, the grove of pines where the bulldozers had torn through, and the spot where I'd found hemlocks. Buried iron pin. Nature was reclaiming it fast. Grasses grew where tire ruts had been. The birds had returned louder and less wary. Even the lake's current seemed to have softened the ripples slower, more deliberate, as if the water itself had learned patience. I anchored for a while in the shadow of cabin number 7, the one nearest the center of the island. Its new owner, a retired nurse named Doris Lee, had transformed it into something beautiful, hanging flower baskets, wind chimes, a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. She stepped outside, just then saw me floating nearby, and waved. "You must be Mr. Hale," she called, "the man who made this all possible." I smiled and waved back. I just kept the place from falling apart. "Well, we're all grateful," she said, voice carrying across the water. "This island feels safe, like it remembers being loved. Remembers being loved." Those words stuck with me all the way back to shore, because that's exactly what it felt like, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. That evening, I walked into town for groceries. The locals still treated me like a minor celebrity. Free coffee, too many thank you stories retold until they barely resembled the truth. The myth of the man who outsmarted the HOA had grown legs longer than my patience. But I let it happen. People need stories. It helps them believe good can still win. At the general store, I ran into Deputy Harris again. He'd been promoted to code enforcement chief after his apology, and he greeted me like an old friend. "Got your file cleared completely," he said, handing me a thin envelope. "All liens, disputes, and claims gone. The title to your island is cleaner than a preacher's conscience." "Appreciate it," I said. He hesitated. "You planning to keep living here long term? As long as the knees hold out?" He grinned. "Good. This place needs you." Walking home under the soft orange of dusk, I passed what used to be the gated entrance of Cedar Crest. The sign was gone, replaced by a handmade one carved from reclaimed pine. "Welcome to Hale Point. No boards, no fines, just neighbors." Someone had added a small detail beneath it, a painted bluebird sitting on a branch. I had no idea who'd done it, but I like to think Helen would have smiled at the whimsy. When I got home, Riley was waiting on the porch, a suitcase beside her. "Surprise," she said, grinning. "Took a week off work. Figured you could use some company." "You figured right," I said, hugging her. "You staying long enough to see spring bloom depends," she teased. "You gonna let me help build that greenhouse you keep talking about?" We spent the next morning hammering together a frame behind the house. It wasn't much, some lumber corrugated panels and a lot of laughter. Riley had her mother's determination, the kind that makes a hammer swing look like choreography. While we worked, she asked something unexpected. "Dad, do you ever miss her?" "Not Mom, I know that answer. I mean, Marla. The fight." I stopped mid-swing. "You think I miss that?" She shrugged. "Sometimes people get used to the storm. When it's gone, the quiet can feel empty." I considered that. Maybe I missed the focus I admitted. When you're fighting, you know exactly what matters. But peace asks you to notice everything again. It's harder work. She nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you seem to be doing it right." By mid-afternoon, we'd finished the frame. The greenhouse gleamed in the sun, small but solid, another little victory built with patient hands. I caught Riley smiling as she wiped sweat from her forehead. "You know," she said, "I think this lake is finally on your side." That night we sat on the dock wrapped in blankets, listening to the gentle slap of water against the pilings. The moon reflected perfectly round, unbroken. "You ever gonna write all this down?" she asked softly. Why would I? Because people forget. They forget that greed can lose, that one person can make a difference. You could help someone else fighting their own HOA Karen out there. I laughed quietly. You've got a point. But I think the lake already remembers enough for both of us. She rested her head on my shoulder. Still, maybe someday. We stayed there until the lanterns from the cabins went out one by one and the lake swallowed the world in silence. Later, as I locked up the house, I glanced at the framed photo of Helen and me on our first dock, her hand resting on my shoulder, her smile bright and fearless. Beneath it hung another frame, the official court order from the case. For a long time I'd kept it as a trophy. But now it just felt like history, something finished, like a chapter turned. Before going to bed, I opened the window and let the sound of the water fill the room. Somewhere out there, a loon called, "Low, steady, eternal." The next morning I woke early and took a walk along the shoreline. Mist hung low, curling around the pines. In the distance, I saw a group of children from the cabins launching tiny wooden boats, each one painted in bright colors. They cheered as the wind caught their sails and sent them drifting toward open water. It hit me then. This lake wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who respected it, everyone who'd learned from its story. And maybe that was the point all along, not to own, but to protect. The water remembers everything. It remembers loss and laughter, greed and grace. It remembers the weight of injustice and the quiet that comes after redemption. And as I watched those little boats sail, I realized that in its own way, the lake had forgiven us all. Summer returned to Lake Whitmore with a kind of unhurried grace. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and sun-warmed water dragonflies zipped over the reeds, and the ripples that once carried anger now carried laughter. Every morning I still woke up before dawn, brewed my mug of black coffee, and sat on the dock. Helen and I had rebuilt in spirit. But something had changed in me. The fight had burned out, leaving only the clarity that follows when you've seen both the best and worst of people and somehow still believe in them. I've been thinking a lot about that word lately, believe. It's easy to believe when things are calm, when your home stands untouched, your neighbors wave, and your life hums quietly. But belief tested under pressure, belief that survives bulldozers and bureaucracy, that's the kind worth keeping. By late June, the new community around the lake had fully come alive. The cabins I'd once watched rise like insults now stood like promises. Families picnicked on porches, teenagers paddled canoes, and every weekend the smell of barbecue drifted across the water. There were no association rules, no decorum codes, no one patrolling with clipboards. And yet somehow everything stayed neat and beautiful. People took care of what was theirs, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. That, I realized, was what freedom really looked like. Responsibility without coercion, respect without fear. One Saturday morning, I hosted the first Lake Whitmore cleanup day. I didn't make a big announcement, just mentioned it casually to a few neighbors at the store. But when I rode out to the island that morning, I found over 30 people already there, gloves on, trash bags in hand. Doris brought muffins, George set up a grill for lunch, and even the teenagers showed up with fishing nets to scoop debris from the shallows. As we worked, I overheard pieces of conversation that made me smile. "You know, I used to hate living near a lake," one man said. "Too many rules. Now I can't imagine anywhere else." By noon, the island looked better than it ever had, not just clean, but cared for. I stood at the water's edge, wiping sweat from my brow, and realized something profound. The lake had become what the HOA claimed it wanted: to build a real community. When the cleanup ended, someone suggested naming the new public dock. There was laughter, debate, and finally unanimous agreement on a simple choice: Helen's Landing. They even surprised me with a small brass plaque. The words read, "For the woman who taught one man and one lake how to stand firm with grace." I don't cry easily, but that one hit me hard. That evening, as the sky burned orange over the tree line, I sat on the dock with Riley. She decided to spend the whole summer at the lake, working remotely and helping the neighbors with their gardens. She'd grown into a version of her mother, calm, steady, with the same fire tucked behind her quiet smile. "Dad," she said, breaking the silence, "I think Mom would be proud of what you did." I nodded. "I think she'd be proud of what we did." She smiled. "Do you ever miss the noise, the fight, that rush of proving everyone wrong?" I thought about it. "No," I said honestly. "Fighting feels good when you're angry, but peace feels like breathing again." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "You think people ever learn from stories like yours?" "Maybe," I said. "But most people have to feel the storm before they believe in the calm." A few days later, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the State Department of Environmental Affairs, thanking me for my efforts in restoring the integrity of Lake Whitmore's watershed and inviting me to speak at a regional conference about community-led restoration projects. The thought of standing in front of a crowd again made my stomach twist. I was no politician, just a tired old engineer who refused to be bullied off his own land. But Riley insisted, "Dad, this isn't about speeches. It's about legacy." So I went. The conference was held in a glass building overlooking another lake cleaner, bigger but somehow emptier than mine. When they called my name, I walked to the podium, hands, steady, voice clear. I didn't use notes. I didn't quote laws or cite regulations. I just told the truth. I didn't set out to fight anyone I began. I set out to keep what was already mine, not just land but memory. The dock my wife and I built, the soil, my father left me, the quiet I'd earned after 35 years in uniform. When someone tried to take it, I didn't fight back with anger. I fought back with patience. Because patience builds foundations that lies can't crack. The room went silent. I told them how the HOA built without permits, how greed turned neighbors into hostages, and how truth backed by maps, iron pins, and stubborn resolve dismantled an empire. But the real victory, I finished, wasn't in court. It was when the noise stopped and people started listening again to the land, to the water, and to each other. When I stepped down, people stood and clapped. A few even wiped their eyes. I smiled, embarrassed but proud. Not for myself, for what the story had become proof that decency still wins even if it takes the long way around. That night back home, I walked down to the lake one last time before bed. The moonlight shimmered across the surface like molten silver. Somewhere out there, frogs croaked in chorus, and a breeze carried the faint scent of pine. I knelt, touched the water with my fingertips, and whispered, "You remember, don't you?" The water rippled softly against my hand as if answering always. I don't know if the lake truly remembers, or if memory is just what we project onto things we love, but I know this: every action leaves a ripple. Every choice to build, to destroy, to forgive moves outward, shaping lives we'll never meet. And if this lake has taught me anything, it's that you can't own peace. You can only earn it, protect it, and pass it on. So when people ask what happened to the man whose HOA built 23 cabins on his island, I tell them this: he let them finish, and then he finished better. Because revenge isn't rage, revenge is restoration. The kind that leaves the world quieter than it was before. And now, as I sit on this dock, coffee in hand, watching the sun climb over Helen's Landing, I finally understand what she meant all those years ago when she said, "A home isn't built by hands, it's built by heart." She was right. And this time, I think the lake agrees. In the end, this story isn't about property lines or court orders. It's about the boundaries we draw between right and wrong, and how easily they blur when greed takes the wheel. I learned that power built on arrogance always collapses, but strength built on truth endures. Life will test you with people who mistake kindness for weakness, who think silence means surrender. But the real measure of power is not how loud you shout, it's how steady you stand. So wherever you're watching from, remember, paper burns but stone lasts. Do what's right even when it's quiet. Protect what you love even when no one's watching. And if this story moved, you leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, what you're fighting for, or what peace means to you. Don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another storm to weather, another lake to calm, and another story worth telling.